obviously you don't want your view on religion summarized by it's good for stupid people.
Well, I do want it summarized to some degree that way, because one of the things
yes,
we do.
I'm giving you the opportunity again to put this foot in your mouth.
But I would say not only. I mean, the thing is that we're all stupid, and some of us are far stupider than others.
But we're not. But we're not that stupid. I mean,
but there's another problem, Sam. I think, and this is obviously a contentious one. And one of the things I don't go to church, but there is one thing I admire about the church, and that is that it's managed to serve as a repository for these fundamental underlying fictions for 2 millennia. And that's really something bloody unbelievable. I mean, the great, what would you say?
It is bloody unbelievable.
Well, look, Sam, everything's soaked in blood. We have no disagreement about that, but the secular alternatives that we produced in the 20th century were certainly no less blood-sodden, and they produced nothing of any productivity whatsoever.
We need not do it now, but we have to put to bed that secular canard.
What would you do?
Well, it's just not so that Stalinism was the product of secularism or atheism, and nor were
well, it was
fascism.
a product. It wasn't an inevitable product or the product.
It wasn't. And please, anyone who has this meme in your head, please just allow the next sentences I speak to just push it out, because I'm so sick of hearing this. This idea that the greatest crimes of the 20th century were somehow the product of atheism. Right. When you look at what actually engineered these atrocities, it was something that looked very much like a religion. It was a religion in every way apart from an explicit commitment to otherworldliness. It was based on
that's a big difference.
Dogmatism through and through. It was based on personality cults that grew up around figures like Stalin and Hitler and Mao. It was not the ideas of Bertrand Russell and David Hume that brought us to the Gulag or to Auschwitz.
Yes, but then you can't say it's the thought of Jesus Christ either. I mean,
well, no, it's true. No, I can say that. I can say it was the thought of St. Augustine, and I can say it was the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas explicitly that gave us the Inquisition. This is a fact.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
I mean, this is a general one as well as one for tonight, but the whole discussion, I mean, I said the other night in Dublin that to a great extent, when the history books are written about the period we're living in, they'll probably be described as the post-Holocaust period in history, the post-World War II era in Europe. It's still going on. So we're still going through this, trying to work out what happened. And I have to say, one thing that I, at any rate, am equally tired of is the claim that this has got to be a tennis game between the religious and the non-religious. That people say that the 20th century's crimes were committed by atheists. Sometimes true, often wrong. Or that the 20th century's crimes were committed by people who were religious. Sometimes true, often wrong.
No, but you're not observing a crucial distinction here, because I would never be tempted to hold religion accountable for the bad things that religious people do that have no connection to religion. Right? So if a Muslim robs a liquor store, I'm not going to blame Islam for that. Right? There's no doctrine.
Not then.
There's no doctrine.
Especially not then.
There's no doctrine that makes sense of that behavior. What I blame religion for, and likewise, there's no doctrine in the mere loss of religion, i.e. atheism, that gets you the Gulag.
Well,
right?
hang on. Well, there is.
No, there's not. But let me just flesh out this point for one more second. The only thing I blame religion for are the things that it becomes rational to do by the light of these beliefs. If you accept these doctrines, a rational and good person can be tempted to join ISIS. That's my concern. A rational and good person can be tempted to support the Inquisition.
But of the many things they had in common, this is the point that David Berlinski made in his book, what did the NKVD have in common with everyone who oversaw the Gulag, the SS, the people who guarded the camps, the people who put people on trains? What did they all have in common? What did they have in common with Mao? Among other things, they had in common the fact that none of them thought that God was watching them. none of them thought that they were being observed and would be held accountable.
It doesn't help when you think God is on your side. We have just as many examples where people do it because they think God is on their side, right?
Sure.
God is watching and clapping.
I'm not denying that. I'm saying that the attempt to make this a tennis match over the 20th century is a mistake. We're still trying to work out what caused it. Religion had a role, atheism had a role. But the perpetual tennis match of it, I think.
Well, and there is something to be said at a more sophisticated level, I would say, for the idea that you have an obligation to a transcendent ethic. Now, you make that claim in the moral landscape. You lay out a transcendent ethic, in my estimation. That's one that puts the onus of responsibility on the individual to act in a way that, at minimum, minimizes suffering. And you think of that as a statement of fact, that's the proper way of being, and I think about it as an axiomatic statement of faith, and that's one of our differences. But I have been very careful in my analysis of the relationship between the idea of sovereignty and the idea of religious belief. And one of the things that I have worked out, I think, partly from reading such people as Eliade and Jung, was that there is an emergent idea of sovereignty that does involve being accountable to a God. And here's how I would justify that, and I would think about this essentially from a practical and biological perspective, independent of any metaphysical reality that it might have. So the ancient Mesopotamians, for example, believed that their emperor was the incarnation or the representative of a god named Marduk, and that actually bestowed certain ethical responsibilities on the ruler. And so the ruler had to be a good Marduk in order to be a sovereign, to be regarded as sovereign. He had to be the embodiment of these divine principles. And it took the Mesopotamians a very, very long period of time, perhaps several tens of thousands of years. They weren't Mesopotamian during that whole time, obviously, to work out what those principles of sovereignty should be. And the Mesopotamians encoded this in their fictions, in their religious fictions, making essentially the proposition that the proper ruler had to have eyes all the way around his head, because that was one of the attributes of Marduk. So he was someone who was genuinely paying attention, who was capable of coming into voluntary contact with the great chaotic substructure of being and cutting it into pieces and making the habitable world, and also speaking words that were truthful, that had the power, the magic power of truth. And the ruler had to act that out if he was going to be the sort of ruler that his people weren't entitled to slay and sacrifice. And then once a year at the New Year's festival, he would go outside the city, the walled city, and he would act out his role of Marduk. And the priest would humiliate him and ask him to confess all the ways that he hadn't been a good Marduk, so that he could remember that he had a responsibility to undertake to embody this relationship with these divine principles. And the thing that's so important about this, that's so absolutely crucially important, is that it established the principle that even if you were at the top of a hierarchy, you weren't absolute. There was something above you that you were subordinate to. And one of the extraordinarily useful ideas about the abstraction of even God as a personified spirit, let's say, is that it allows every leader to be subordinate to something that's beyond him. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be misused, but it's a very, very, very important idea.
Yeah, except you can get there the other way around. You can realize that even if you're at the top of the hierarchy, you are radically dependent on everyone else. The tip of the pyramid.
But everybody at the tip of a hierarchy doesn't believe that. Sometimes they believe that they can do whatever the hell they want.
Yeah, but I'm saying if you're going to believe something that's compatible with rationality globally and has the least conceivable downside, I would put in that place not a superstitious attachment to a notion of an invisible friend or punisher who's above you. I would put in its place the totally defensible and palpably true fact that you could be the king of the world, and you are dependent on everyone around you to eat, to not be murdered by them. I mean, you are. I mean, it's amazing how precarious even a a totalitarian regime is. I mean, the amazing thing is that these last at all, because in many cases it would just take 50 people to act in unison to kill the tyrant, right? But it never happens because you just have a first mover problem. Everyone is afraid to be the first person shot. But it is a genuine mystery that these systems even perpetuate themselves. And when they unravel, when you see, you know, Gaddafi being murdered in a crowd, you realize, wow, it really is just a matter of the restraint and fear of human beings keeping any of these things together. A benign, if you wanted a hierarchy where you had a kind of benign philosopher king pulling the reins of a society, I'm not saying we do, but even there, you could have an ethical one. You could have one where, and a non-superstitious one where someone recognized, hey, this is how we're doing it, but we are radically, at the top of this hierarchy, am radically dependent on being surrounded by as many happy people as possible.
Well, look, I mean, I don't, in some profound sense, I don't disagree with that.
We're actually, you know, I mean, this sounds like a fiction, but we're living with this problem, and we encounter this more and more when you talk, you know, in Silicon Valley, as you and I occasionally do, and I'm sure you do as well, where you meet people who are fantastically wealthy, who seem uncannily detached at the detached at the fact that there's this growing chasm between them and those they know and the rest of humanity, and one begins to wonder, what level of wealth inequality will everyone find alarming? And some people are acting as though there is no level that is alarming, that there's a kind of a law of nature that this thing can grow just impossibly to the point where we have trillionaires walking around and you know, in driving in their motorcades. And it's kind of it's sort of the libertarian religion one occasionally runs into. And clearly there's some level of inequality that's untenable, or at least would be undesirable. I mean,
well, it's a funny thing, because that's a place where our thought loops and then agrees to some degree again, because I do believe that you can, in some sense, rationally derive an ethic. So let's take the argument that you put forward and say that, well, and this is an extension of your well-being argument to some degree, which I've thought about a fair bit. It's like, well, okay, what's the optimal solution for you? Well, okay, well, first of all, there isn't just you now. There's you now, and you tomorrow, and you next week, and you in a year, you in 5 years. So there's you and the you that propagates across time. So one of the implications of that is that you can't do anything that's really good for the you now that isn't very good for you a week from now, right?
Yeah.
So that means you have to imagine yourself as multiple individuals across multiple time frames. And then you have to figure out what's good for all those individuals across all those time frames, although you discount the future to some degree because of its unpredictability. But then, so that's a very tight set of constraints. And you might say, well, a rational person would calculate what was optimal across all those multiple time frames. Then you do the same thing with other people, which is the point you just made. Well, it isn't just you, because who's you? There's you and your family. And most people are in a situation where they would regard damage to their family as perhaps even worse than damage to them. So whatever they are obviously encapsulates their family, and then to some degree that flows off into the community. And so there is no isolated you, and that's sort of your point with regards to the ethic. But then, so I agree with all that, but then one of the things that I would suggest is that, because that's an incredibly difficult rational calculation, and perhaps an impossible one, technically speaking, but certainly very difficult, that what has happened in part as our great narratives have emerged across time is that we have observed ourselves attempting to solve that multiple identity, multiple time frame problem, and we've told stories about people who do that exceptionally well, and then we've winnowed out those stories, and we've produced these powerful narratives that encapsulate the ethic that does in fact reflect that wisdom. And and I think you actually accept some of that in your moral propositions, which is something that we've talked about before. So for example, although never really agreed on, you certainly believe, for example, that the embodiment of truth is one of the means whereby you solve the problem of ethics. And I would say that that's a deeply rooted Judeo-Christian concept, that the truth
it's so
above
deeply
all.
rooted that it precedes any notion of religious provincialism. I mean, it's deeper than Judeo-Christian. It's deeper than our humanity on some level. At one point, we talked about the golden rule, and I said that the precursor to the golden rule can be found even among monkeys, right?
Right,
so
right.
The golden rule is a
Rats,
good rule
yes.
even for monkeys.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And so,
But let me just add to
Yeah,
the
yeah.
picture you sketched out. I completely agree with. We have an ethical obligation even to our future selves, right? I mean, we are in relationship to who's going to be the person who's drinking his fourth scotch tonight has some ethical relationship to the person who's going to wake up with a hangover tomorrow morning, and one thing we know for sure, and which we have begun to dimly understand and describe scientifically, is that we are bad at all of these calculations,
Yes.
right? Like the hyperbolic discounting of future rewards.
well, that's
and-
also why I think we have these stringent limitations on rationality, Sam, is that we can't solve the problem through calculation.
Well, no, but we increasingly can, and even where it's best summarized not by one thing I'll grant you is that it's not always best conveyed or rendered indelible and actionable by being given a nature paper or an abstract from a paper in the literature and being told this is the way you want to behave to maximize your well-being. It may best be conveyed by certain stories,